I'm making a game called Spark, which is a cute boss fighting game where you play as a tiny flame in search of rescuing his family. This is a mix of platforming, combat, and exploration. With being already a year in development, let me catch you up. Starting with my character named Spark. I randomly thought of an idea to make a flame as the main character for my game. At this point, everything was going to be 2D, so I made this monstrosity of a 2D PNG ball of a blue flame. And then later came to my senses and opted to simulate the entire thing. And with these cute little eyes. These eyes were hell to animate. Putting animated PNG sequences at certain times, like when the player's jumping, looked disgustingly choppy. So I coded an entire procedural animation system for just the eyes. A bounce system, a looking system, a blinking system, so many systems. Yeah, I bet now you realize why it's been taking me a little over a year to actually make this game. As for the movement system, I ran into a few minor bugs with the character's physics. Oi. Guess what the fix was? What could possibly fix this?
It ended up being a flippin' checkbox.
Something that I've discovered on my game designing journey is that most of the problems are just a tiny little button hidden somewhere in the ether that you have to find, not on any documentation, so you have to spend hours until you click that one tiny button. Okay, anyways, later I figured out that my flame actually looks like burning cheese. So the next thing I changed was the fire shader, which was basically a bunch of random boxes being checked and a texture scrolling effect on the material, which made it look not like burning cheese. Now we move on to attacks and abilities. The main attack used to be like a flick of fire that the flame emits, and I later found out it sucked. It didn't at all have any kind of feeling of impact, so I opted for a sort of fire sling that shoots a fireball and slings around the player and bursts if it hits something. Next, the player needed a range ability, so I added a shootable fireball and then stopped there because I didn't want to get too carried away. After I added a shotgun, a bouncing bullet, a charging ability, ground slamming, double jumping, dashing, and wall climbing abilities. See how well I focus on the essentials for the game? Like, I don't know, the levels and enemies? Anyways, I scrapped the wall climbing because of the performance of casting every frame, which brings me to enemies. Okay, so enemies brought up a tiny issue with performance. So if you got into Unreal Engine, watched a few tutorials, and see that everyone is teaching you to cast, they are literally setting you up for another Devastator explosion. So if you are an idiot like me, you wouldn't have seen this tiny little message while hovering over the casting node. Instead of casting, you can use tags to find objects and characters, but sometimes there is no escaping for the need of references from casting. Anyways, I made this advanced 3D model in Blender and this complex jumping animation for my Marshmallow enemy. I also created this material system that allows me to slowly burn them to a crisp, switching them from painted textures to different painted textures that I made, so it looks very crisp and satisfying. Wait, note to self, I should totally record audio of the crisp crunch of a burnt marshmallow. I made a few variants of marshmallows, including a tiny variant and a rolling variant. The rolling variant just has a simple system that says turn around when it hits something, while the tiny variant actually just squashes and explodes when the player jumps on top of him. I plan on making as many enemy variants to keep the game fresh with content. I needed to test how many I can fit on the same screen, so I set them to constantly spawn, and as my FPS plummeted faster than my sanity, I realized something. Are they climbing? I have accidentally made my marshmallows intelligent enough to make a freaking human pyramid to kill me. This actually sparked another idea. I should make a horde mode where you survive the
FPS drops.
Anyways, that's for a later episode once I actually stay on track for once and make the story mode, which segues me to the next topic of this video: environment and story design. So I wanted 3 distinct environments for the player to adventure through. So I invented the ground quakes, the chocolate gates, and the frozen shakes. Notice the theme? The ground quakes is basically a rainy cave environment with mine shafts and crystals to lay up the cave. The chocolate gates is an ocean of chocolate that I will have the player sail in on and adventure into chocolate caverns. The frozen shakes, however, is a frozen tundra full of iced caves and mountains. At least that's the idea. So for the cave-like environment, I drafted some levels with some simple cubes and rock assets. I designed these railroad tracks that the player has to avoid and these arrow shooters. I made some quick destroyable assets and lootable chests that the player can find scattered throughout the levels. What I need to do is make the enemies and bosses, which is something that I'm actually looking forward to doing. Most likely the next episode will involve local multiplayer and character abilities and cosmetics, even though I should be focusing on enemies. That will hopefully be like episode 3. Please feel free to suggest any ideas for the game or just yell at me to not focus on the small features that don't matter. Actually, what would help me the most is if you go over to Steam and type in Spark, click on the orange logo, and wishlist my game. Wishlisting lets you know when the game is actually coming out and helps me with the Steam algorithm overlords. Thanks, and go leave this digital realm.